Hi, my name is Lindy Jung. I am a science fiction and fantasy writer, and today I wanted to share some tips on how to write historical fiction. So this video was actually requested by a viewer a couple weeks ago, and I figured that if this works, if you guys like this, then I would definitely go ahead and make short tip videos like this for other genres, so just let me know what other genres you'd like to see in the future. I will say, as a little disclaimer, historical fiction is not the main thing that I write. I would say that I write a fair amount of historical fantasy, so kind of, historical fiction with a speculative element. I've got to have that speculative element. I can't really say that I am giving you decisive tips for how to write straight up historical fiction, but I figured I'd put what knowledge I have to use. And of course, like always, the usual disclaimer applies. Prescriptivist writing advice for anything is for the birds, and we do not do that here. These are just some tips that I came up with based on my experience as a writer. You can either take them or leave them. If they don't work for you, that's totally fine. I just hope that they help a couple of you out there. I want to keep this video pretty short, so let's just jump right into it. Number one is that research is important, but it isn't everything. This is a two-parter. It probably sounds pretty obvious if you're thinking about historical fiction. Unless you came into this world with that historical era downloaded into your brain, you're probably going to have to pick up at least like 5 or 6 books. But personally, I kind of have noticed that some of the historical fiction that I read that feels a little drier is the kind that gets bogged down by how much research the author has done. It's amazing if you have spent months or even years doing all your research. It's amazing if you have a degree in that historical era. If you care more about the historical accuracy aspect of things as opposed to the story and the characters, then maybe you should be just writing historical nonfiction rather than historical fiction. Of course, that's like very prescriptivist, and every historical fiction writer is going to have to find their own balance between historical details and character and story, but there should be a story and there should be characters. So basically, do your research, get as involved as you need to be in that research, but don't forget about the story itself, because at the end of the day, fiction is about the storytelling. Tip number 2 is avoid glaring anachronisms. Anachronisms? I don't actually know how that word is pronounced. Probably should have looked it up. I would say this is where your beta readers are going to come in handy. Sometimes we don't even know what tics or modern verbiage or slang we're using subconsciously. I'm going to give you a little bit of like blanket calming advice. You're never going to get everything 100% accurate. More likely than not, you're going to make a couple mistakes here and there in terms of accuracy, and someone might even point them out or notice them. But that doesn't mean you should get lazy. I would say, especially if you're an experienced writer going into writing historical settings for the first time, be aware of how modern your voice is. Be aware of how you living in the here and now in the 21st century, how that's going to influence the way you write, and maybe even read some pieces from that time period if you can, to sort of figure out what that voice is, or like what kind of vocabulary they're using. Tip number 3 is sometimes it's more about meeting expectations than being strictly accurate. People in general have a lot of misconceptions about history. Sometimes it is better to sort of cater toward those general expectations, even if it's not necessarily the most accurate picture of, say, like daily life in medieval times. Like if I am cracking open a book about medieval court life, I'm kind of expecting like court politics, intrigue, backstabbing, and maybe even like a knight or some royal stuff. I don't know. Of course, if you are writing a story that is told from the point of view of a chambermaid or a servant in the castle, that is totally valid, but I don't know, you might want to throw in some fan service here and there. Number 4 is the opposite of number 3, and it's that sometimes it's more fun to subvert expectations, actually. So something that I learned while researching this video is that Vikings actually dyed their hair blonde. Like a lot of them were not natural blondes. That was the beauty standard of the time. They were basically the equivalent of me in like 2012. That obviously goes against a lot of stereotypes held about Vikings. The other thing about them is that they were super hygienic. They took baths like 4 times a day sometimes. They just really cared about hygiene and looking nice, and that very much goes against the popular conception that they were these big, muscly, grizzled guys who were constantly covered in blood and filth. I think that's a really fun detail. I think it would be fun to play around with people's misconceptions and mix that up with how the actual reality was. There are a ton of details in history like that, especially with eras that have been so heavily scrutinized or made popular by pop culture and media, like the Vikings, medieval times in Europe, various time periods of Japan and China. One of the things that strikes me the most is that I feel like a lot of people have this preconceived notion that human beings were just like uncivilized, unwashed, diseased all the time, couldn't get their crap together until like 65 or whatever. Modern America did not invent the bath, and prior to medical developments like inoculations, there were a lot of different ways to treat various illnesses. So consider the stereotypes of whatever era you're writing in and consider how those might be subverted by reality. Number 5 is pay attention to voice and tone. Historical fiction writing, it tends to feel a lot more austere in terms of the tone and the voice. It's not going to have that very familiar close first, close third point of view most of the time. Of course you can have that, but it's not going to feel like, you know, a daily vlog or whatever like some modern writing does. There's usually a fair amount of distance, and there's usually more of like, I don't want to say advanced, but like a very particular style and tendency of the vocabulary, if that makes sense. So my tip here is to read a lot of historical fiction and historical fantasy, whatever you like. Try to get a feel for that specific voice or tone. And there are different ones, but try to pinpoint the one that you like that will suit your story and characters. Work out how that is constructed either through syntax or like sentence structure or flow. Number 6 is consider global context for your time period. One thing that tends to bother me about historical fiction, and this even bleeds into fantasy, that even if it's not set in a specific real life time period, is that they will often feel like they're very much in a bubble. That makes sense because prior to like the communication boom, people's worlds tended to be a lot smaller. Travel was not as accessible. You know, you couldn't send an email to anyone on the other side of the world and ask how they're doing. So yes, people's worlds were a lot smaller, but that doesn't mean that the outside world had no influence. Whether you're writing your story in the isolationist era of Edo Japan or setting it on the Silk Road at its peak, other cultures and types of people and nations and classes will always be somewhere in the background, exerting their influence on that little bubble you have set your story in. One of the areas where I'll notice this the most is diversity, where people who are choosing to write their story in a setting that is primarily viewed as ethnically homogenous or racially homogenous. You know, you see this all the time, like people will argue, well, there were no Black or Asian people in medieval Europe, when that isn't strictly the case. People in medieval Europe were very aware of the nations and different types of people outside of their world. Human dispersion and immigration, while it wasn't happening at the rate that it's happening today for obvious reasons, it was still very much happening. I think it's really frustrating to see someone have developed this like insular world of a certain time period so well, and then see that they've obviously forgotten to consider the outside world. Very few societies exist in such a bubble. I think it is important and also interesting to consider the outside world, the greater scope of things within that time period. Okay, and tip number 7, consider why you're writing this specific time period and historical setting. This could be for any reason. It could be because you think it's cool. It could be because you've spent a long time studying this time period and you really want to put that knowledge to work. Those are all super valid reasons. You could also have a personal connection to that time period, or you want to write about something like a historical period that is underexplored that you have some sort of connection or tie to. Those things will definitely help you maintain your passion for researching and writing about that historical time period. But the one thing that I do want you to consider is, how does this time period influence your story, and why is it necessary to set your story in this time period? Or not even necessary, but why is it warranted? Basically, I want you to make sure that the story and the setting cannot be taken apart. If you're writing a story that could be set in virtually any time period, then try including some historically specific elements that really justify the setting. And one thing to note here is that there might even be a different or possibly even underexplored historical period that your story might work better in. So consider your themes, your characters, your story as a whole, and think about why this particular period is calling to you, and if maybe it isn't the most effective setting for your story. That is all. Those are 7 quick tips for writing historical fiction. Let me know what other genres you'd like to see, and thank you so much. I'll see you next time.